and white trash talking.
Hi, I'm Doug Johnson, and I'm White Trash Talking. So Trump recently issued a warning to Putin that he had 50 days to stop the war, which Trump this week modified to 10 to 12 days. At the same time, Trump has agreed to a surge of weapons being sent to NATO countries, which will almost certainly be used against Russia from Ukraine. Today, I want to look at what's going on in the war in Ukraine and begin to unravel some of the mixed messages and propaganda by the U.S. to look at its underlying policies, which are actually consistent and enduring. By contextualizing U.S. actions towards Russia within the U.S.'s global agenda, a singular strategy begins to emerge that is predictable in terms of motivations and even logical sequence. Suddenly, everything becomes clear, including Trump's recent threats. I will present the views of Brian Berletic, upon whom nearly everything I say here is based. Brian Berletic is a former U.S. Marine, a geopolitical analyst, writer, and podcast host of the New Atlas. The clips I present come from his podcast and from his interview on the Glenn Deason podcast, and I recommend both of these podcasts. They're excellent. The source materials I present are linked in his article that he wrote this month called Ukraine Proxy War, Trump Picks Up Where Biden Left Off, and it's published in the New Eastern Outlook. But first, I want to play a short speech by U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth from last February in his opening remarks to the Ukraine Defense Contact Group in Brussels. This is what he said.
The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. As part of this, Europe must provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. Members of this contact group must meet the moment. This threat can only be met by spending more on defense. 2% is not enough. President Trump has called for 5%, and I agree. Increasing your commitment to your own security is a down payment for the future, a down payment, as you said, Mr. Secretary, of peace through strength. The U.S. is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific, recognizing the reality of scarcity and making the resourcing trade-offs to ensure deterrence does not fail. As the United States prioritizes its attention to these threats, European allies must lead from the front. Together, we can establish a division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and Pacific, respectively.
Hegseth's speech lays out the strategic sequencing of U.S. actions towards Russia, Iran, and China, as well as the division of labor required to achieve the strategy. Understanding this is the key to seeing the bigger picture. Here's Brian Berletic to explain what the proxy war in Ukraine is about.
We have to ask ourselves, what is this war in Ukraine? Is it some sort of misunderstanding between Ukraine and Russia? No. Is it even a misunderstanding between Europe and Russia? Absolutely not. It's not even a misunderstanding between the U.S. and Russia. It was a very deliberately engineered proxy war waged against Russia as part of this very long since the end of the Cold War, this idea that no peer or near peer competitor can be allowed to rise. That includes Russia in Europe, Iran in the Middle East, and China in the Asia-Pacific region. They're going to encircle and contain these countries. They're going to destabilize nations along their borders, along their periphery. They're going to transform them into battering rams to use against these nations themselves. So that was always the intention. That is why this war is being waged against, or as a U.S. war being waged against Russia through Ukraine. There are U.S. generals as the New York Times reported, at the very top of the chain of command, ordering Ukrainian troops. And of course, the Western media also revealed that from 2014 onward, the U.S., the Central Intelligence Agency, controls the civilian and military intelligence agencies of Ukraine. So when we see the SBU or whoever it is claiming to carry out these assassinations in Russia of journalists, of generals, of politicians, that is the CIA doing that. They're overseeing this. They created these units, they trained them, and they enable absolutely all of this. And so it is a U.S. war against Russia through Ukraine. They want Europe to ramp up, take public money away from the actual European public and channel it into this to free up more resources for the U.S. to pivot elsewhere. They need to dismember Iran in the Middle East to further isolate both Russia and China, and ultimately they need to begin encircling and containing China. It is rising rapidly, and there will be a point of no return where it irreversibly surpasses the West, and there's nothing the U.S. can do to change that. And so they're racing against the clock, and this is why they're doing it.
The point of this war was not to defeat Russia in Ukraine. If that was a possibility, of course, the US and its European proxies, its client states in Europe and elsewhere, would attempt to do that. But the primary purpose of this proxy war against Russia in Ukraine is to entangle Russia in a costly, protracted conflict. And that is exactly what has happened, is to raise the cost for Russia and to keep its resources tied up in Ukraine so that Russia cannot respond elsewhere, like, say, in Syria, or in regards to Iran, or in any way shore up Russian strength either internally or elsewhere along its periphery, where the West, the United States and the rest of the West, is applying pressure. And of course, in terms of the US encirclement and containment of China, Russia will have fewer resources to aid in that as well. And the US is doing this to Russia's allies, Iran, and also China, to likewise tie them up in local conflicts along their periphery, preventing them from mobilizing their resources to help their Russian allies or Iranian allies.
So it should be obvious at this point that this is a U.S.-sponsored war against Russia, with Ukraine as its proxy. This article corroborates Brian Berletic's claim that the U.S. is commanding this war at the highest levels from Germany. And a New York Times article from 2024 also reveals the CIA's secret tenure involvement in Ukraine. This is a key document by the Marathon Initiative from 2024, which Brian references. It lays out the strategic sequencing of tying up Russia first before pivoting eastward to Iran and then China. This is also the script from which Pete Hegseth drew in his speech in February. Brian Berletic now goes on to explain the impact of U.S. policy on Russia as well as Ukraine.
People keep saying, well, Russia has defeated the U.S. in Ukraine. Well, the war is still going on. Russia is heavily invested. In fact, to the extent where Russia is overextended. And this was the whole point. There's literally a paper titled Extending Russia by the Rand Corporation in 2019. And it talks about all of these ways you could mire Russia in all of these different conflicts along its periphery. Specifically, they mentioned Ukraine and also Syria. And by tying Russia up in Ukraine from 2022 onward, Russia's commitment to Syria was weakened. It was undermined. And this is what allowed the U.S. to topple Syria ultimately. And so they are forcing Russia to make very difficult decisions. They are doing the exact same thing to Iran and also China. The objective for the U.S. is to keep Russia tied up in Ukraine. So this war, as it's going right now, could continue for several more years even. We don't know where the cracking point is. A lot of people, when they see Russia making advances and they see the Ukrainian military gradually deteriorating, they're tempted to make predictions about when it's all going to collapse, but it hasn't collapsed yet. And then even if it does collapse, we can see the U.S. plan is to send European troops into whatever is left of Ukraine and create a buffer zone and to force a freeze of the conflict. Now, Russia says that they will attack these troops, and this is a standoff that is now taking place. We don't know how it's going to unfold, But that is what they are preparing for. They are openly preparing to do this. This coalition of the willing, that has manifested itself over the last couple of months. This was part of Secretary Hegseth's directive back in February. He told European and non-European troops they are going to go into Ukraine as part of a peace deal. But when he said peace deal, he meant freezing it, a Syria-style buffer zone. And so if the goal is to just keep the war going, this trickle of weapons and support is good enough. They have I don't think they have any serious ambitions of winning this conflict. They have to continue to say that to keep Ukrainians fighting and to keep the general public on board with this. They need to maintain that illusion. They're not going to admit that the plan all along was to fight to the last Ukrainian. And by the way, in the Rand Corporation paper from 2019, they even said that if we provoke a war with Russia in Ukraine, it's almost certainly going to lead to everything that we see taking place now. Huge numbers of casualties, the loss of territory, and a disadvantageous settlement once everything runs out and collapses. The goal now is not to change the course of the conflict. It's to just keep this going for as long as possible while the U.S. pivots and attempts to dismantle Iran and also continues to try to provoke and confront China. And I think it's very important for people to just accept that President Trump lied to them deliberately. He never saw any. He has policy papers that people in his administration wrote that people like Secretary Hegseth are reading from verbatim. This term, division of labor, peace through strength, all of these slogans are from these policy papers, verbatim, word for word. There was no intention. This was for peace or pivoting away from empire and toward multipolarism. There is not a single policy paper anywhere of any significance that has that as a policy objective. It is continuity of agenda. That is what we're watching.
So this is the Rand Corporation article that Brian mentioned, entitled Extending Russia. And it's a key article. It's part of the singular agenda that continues unabated. And in the table of contents of this article, it spells out numerous measures, most of which have already been done by the U.S., to tie down, disrupt, and overextend Russia as part of the wider U.S. plan to pivot east. One measure, which you can see here, is to reduce natural gas exports and hinder pipeline expansion. The U.S. achieved that by blowing up Russia's Nord Stream pipeline in Germany. In regards to the measure of providing lethal military assistance to Ukraine, it says in the document that U.S. planners were aware that this proxy war, as Brian Berletic has already said, could produce, quote, disproportionately large Ukrainian casualties, territorial losses, and refugee flows. There's been over 1 million dead Ukrainian soldiers, and this seems to be something that the West, namely U.S., was willing to risk. Now Brian Berletic discusses the U.S.'s continuity of agenda.
This is a long-standing policy the U.S. has been pursuing for decades and decades, regardless of who is in the White House, regardless of who controls Congress. These are giant corporations who seek power and profit, not just over the entire United States, but over the entire planet Earth. And it's important to keep in mind the role each administration played, from the Obama administration all the way up to the current Trump administration, how each administration is responsible for advancing a different part of this same agenda. It's called continuity of agenda. It's very important to keep in mind. What is the purpose of all of this? We watched President Trump pretend that he wanted peace in Ukraine, and the first step was getting Russia to agree to a ceasefire that would have immediately have been used to freeze the conflict, not actually end it. They would have poured NATO and non-NATO troops into Ukraine, as is the plan, openly is the plan. And they would have froze the conflict, and this would have been a festering national security threat for Russia indefinitely, until it was eventually settled. And the only way it's going to be settled is if Russia settles it itself militarily on the ground. U.S. proposals, Ukrainian proposals, are not honest attempts at peace. They are simply trying to freeze the conflict. It is Minsk 3.0, as Secretary Hegseth claimed it wasn't. We have to look at how all of these conflicts work together, because it is one single global policy the U.S. is pursuing: global hegemony over the entire planet. They're attempting to encircle and contain and eliminate any peer or near-peer adversaries. That includes Russia, that includes Iran, and also China. They also will not tolerate so-called allies having any sort of independent foreign policy. They have politically captured these nations. These are client states of the US. Tying Russia down in Ukraine is just one part of a much larger strategy, not just regarding Russia itself, but regarding all of these other peer and near-peer adversaries the US is trying to take down to maintain its unipolar world order versus this emerging multipolar world. We have to understand that that's where the lines are when we're trying to understand developments as they take place day to day, week to week.
It's hard for people to wrap their minds around all of this. This degree of evil is hard for decent, normal people to fathom. We don't want to believe, we can't believe, that our government or any government can objectify people to this extent as pawns on a chessboard. That millions upon millions of human beings in places like Ukraine, Russia, Gaza, Syria, Iran, China, and eventually the whole world can be slaughtered callously and purposefully in the name of corporate profits by a handful of oligarchs that run the US and the world. Our minds don't want to go there. Sometimes I think that we believe the lies because the truth is unconscionable. We must confront this evil. We must overcome it. As Brian Berletic says, the lines are drawn between the West and BRICS of the global South. Russia, Iran, and China must prevail if we are to preserve humanity and any notion of the common good. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment. I will see you next week. Thank you very much. Bye.